Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I'm glad to rise on this very auspicious day on this very auspicious bill. And it's not just auspicious because we have the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Bill back in the House today. It's also my mum's 70th birthday, and I'm sure all members across the House would like to wish her many happy returns. Thank you. This bill presents a significant opportunity for the Government and for all of us in tackling economic crime across these islands. And while we brought many different amendments through the various stages of this bill, and we bring yet more today, we would very much on these benches encourage the Government to look at these amendments in good faith, because as ministers and as anybody looking at the amendment paper will see, these are very much cross-party amendments. There's a lot more that we agree with in terms of amendments to this bill than I've seen in just about any other bill that has come before this House. And the Government would do well to reflect upon just quite how cross-party these amendments are. There's very little to choose between us, and I would pay tribute to the Honourable Member for Barking for the work that she has done on her all-party group, which has been important and significant in bringing so much cross-party agreement together on the direction of travel in here. And I hope very much that the Minister will be listening to her, as we all will be when we hear her speak later on, because the amount of work that has gone into considering what would make this bill stronger is significant. It is no light job that has been done there, and the bill would be all the more strengthened if those amendments were accepted. I'm happy to give way.
I'll go for giving way, and I'll pay tribute to the Minister for the work that he's done when he was one of us on the back benches on this issue. But when she was speaking about the cross-party nature of the amendments, I couldn't help but think that if the situation was slightly different, that the name of the Minister would be on those amendments.
Yes, and I've remarked upon this during Bill Committee as well, as he will well remember, the number of occasions within this House that he agrees with himself, but now not with himself as a Minister. It's a very curious situation, and I will return to that when we get on to that particular section of the bill which he is most associated with. And there's a lot here, as he says, as we all acknowledge, that we can agree on, that we could come together. And it is unfortunate that more of the amendments have not been taken on board here, because gaps remain in this bill. We are all concerned that there will not be another opportunity to look at these issues again in the detail that we have. Parliamentary time doesn't unfortunately work like that. So getting it right now, this time, is important, and whether we get it right today or tomorrow, or whether perhaps the Lords will come forward with some useful amendments, as little as I like to give credit to the unelected peers along the hall, if there are amendments that are brought there, I would encourage the Government to accept those and to make sure that they are acknowledged. And on these benches we have brought forward a number of amendments where we seek to create a unique identifier for directors, where we seek to put a limit on the number of directorships an individual can hold, where we seek to prevent directors in breach of their duties from taking public funds, where we seek to prevent the practice of phoenixing, which causes so much harm to many of our constituents. And it's not often talked about in the same bracket as economic crime generally, but phoenixing causes huge distress. And my Honourable friend from Renfrewshire will certainly return to this in his remarks later on as well. And starting with first of the Government's new clauses, Clause 8, on persistent breaches of companies' legislation, disqualification of company directors. I think that's a very important thing, because we have seen many times in reports in the press of people who have repeatedly breached the law. There are huge issues of enforcement, and I intend to address those too. But the note that within this legislation, where people breach the rules, don't comply with the rules, there should be some kind of consequence to that. And I wonder what the House and what the Minister would consider about a case that was raised by the organisation Tortoise earlier today around compliance. And they mentioned an organisation called Balshore Investments Limited Gibraltar, who were listed themselves as a company as a person of significant control of a different company called Crowd2 Fund in 2017. They were then removed in 2020, and that removal backdated to 2016. In 2022, two directors named on the register as Najat Al-Zahawi and Harith Nadim Al-Zahawi were named as PSCs of Crowd2 Fund. Graham Barrow has told Tortoise that Balshore's filings leave a huge gap because of this retrospective changing of directors of 6 years, when despite Balshore owning 40% of Crowd2 Fund, no declaration of the underlying owners of Balshore was made, as required by UK law. I think this is a very interesting and a very topical case, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I wonder what the consequences might really be of those who fail to comply with company law in this way under the new legislation, and what might befall them. Moving on to Government New Clause 15, which I think is important in terms of making sure that this House is accountable on the measures within the bill. I think that's fine as far as that goes. I would say that the Labour's New Clause 16 goes much further in this regard. I think it's important that the Minister looks at this and says, well, what does the House need to know? Yes, there'll be reports, but there's a good deal more detail here. And I think it's important to look at that and go, well, actually, this is what the House might find useful and interesting to look at regarding the effectiveness on this bill. Thank you.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving way. I mean, would she agree that waivers for warlords is exactly the kind of information that the House would be interested in order to understand how effectively we are prosecuting economic crime and how well our sanctions are actually biting?
I think it makes an incredibly important point there. And when you see the case that has been reported in the press today of people getting around the rules that we've set up, for very important and significant reasons, that the House should be aware of these things. It shouldn't have to be that these things, this information is squirreled out by investigative journalists. As wonderful and as well informed as these investigative journalists are, it should be something that comes to the House as of right. It shouldn't be something that has to be exposed. It is something that we should know as elected members in this Parliament. Moving on to New Clause 17 around PSC status and verification. I think it's incredibly important that those people are checked, that there are cross-checks in identity, that we do understand who these people are, because one of the great big holes in the system just now is that lack of cross-checking, that lack of ensuring that the rules are being followed, that we ask Companies House to be more inquiring, more inquisitive of the information that they receive. And I think that this new clause by the Honourable Member in Barron-Furness does have that effect, and I think it's very important that Companies House then does have that risk-based approach of looking at these organisations and making sure that what is there is actually factual. Moving to, again, New Clause 19 in the accounts of dissolved companies. Graham Barrow, the expert on many things to do with Companies House, for whom we are all very grateful, pointed out in evidence to the Bill Committee that there is such a thing as a burner company, a company that is set up without the real intention of becoming a real live company out there trading in the world, but it's set up and then it's disposed of without the obligation of having to file any accounts because it's done within the timescale. This new clause 19, I feel, would get some way to dealing with those burner companies, because if you're setting up and dissolving companies on and off, on and off, on and off all the time, it can be very difficult under the current system to know that that's happening. And if there is a means of examining the accounts, if those accounts indeed exist, of dissolved companies, it might be easier to track them and establish if any economic crime is indeed involved within them. Because companies, as Graham Barrow often points out, are being set up in their hundreds every day by organisations that don't even really exist, with suspicious names, with suspicious addresses, hundreds of them registered to one tiny shop or a post office box somewhere. This has to be stamped out. This is the opportunity to stamp this out, because we don't know what those companies are for, why they exist, what they will be used for, and whether or not it's going to be our constituents that will lose out as a result.
To your mother. She may recall the Criminal Finances Act and the process in 2017, where we were talked about this issue about the enforcement and regulatory agencies having the resources to do their job, and us giving them the resources and the finance to do their job. And would she agree with me that we had the Crime and Transparency Enforcement Act last year, we had the Criminal Finances Act in 2017, and this Act, yet again, or this bill, yet again, doesn't give those agencies the resources, the capacity, and the wherewithal in terms of the finance to do the job properly.
I fully agree with him, and he's anticipating that I'm moving on to New Clause 20, which talks to some of these issues in great detail, and a very good amendment it is too. And we've talked about whether the fee of £100 is an arbitrary, is a finger in the wind, is that kind of thing, but it's a figure. It's a figure that we can put in the bill and say, let's start here. That it gives the resource to Companies House with which they can do work. Because it was pointed out by some of those that gave evidence to the Bill Committee that actually, if these hundreds of companies being set up every day at £12 a pop, if we're seeking to clamp down on that, we also need to replace that money with legitimate money, and £100 would go some way to dealing with that gap, perhaps that discrepancy. Making sure that that money goes to increasing the staff at Companies House, increasing the capacity, the ability, the expertise of the people that they can hire as well, because a lot of this is becoming incredibly technical. It's important that they have the resource to do that. All of the agencies involved need that money. Companies House, though, as the front door to a lot of this stuff, needs to be properly resourced so that they can do that. And I know that the Minister talked about not wanting to put in legislation the sum of money that fee would require, but that's not quite how other parts of the system work, because I've sat in statutory instrument committees that set the value of passport fees. I understand, I think as well, that the House sets the value of visa fees. So within the immigration system, this House decides what that fee is and sets that fee, but for companies, that's not what this House is deciding to do. And I don't know if he intends this to come perhaps to a statutory instrument committee at some point in the future to set a fee of £100 or whatever that might be. But that's not what the bill says that he's going to do. And I think it's important to recognise if government in one part of government is setting a fee and deciding how much people should pay for things, and the immigration that other parts of the system should have cost recovery for whatever that is. And I think the visa fee goes way above cost recovery, the passport perhaps less so.
Yep.
£75.50 for a passport compared to £12 at the moment to register a company, compared to £1,538 for a visa. These things are not quite the same. And I think the company fee could bear being significantly higher than the £12 it is at the moment, and there is a place in legislation where we could set that, because that's what the government does in other areas of legislation. Moving swiftly on to some of New Clause 22, that the official opposition were bringing in a person convicted under the Minimum Wage Act not to be appointed as a director. Quite right, I think that's absolutely laudable in its aims, because those people that are flouting the rules shouldn't get to be company directors. Being a company director is a privilege, it is not a right. Exactly. And for those people that have been convicted for not complying with legislation as it stands, I think that's perfectly reasonable that they could be disqualified for a serious breach of the National Minimum Wage Act. And I think it is reasonable to do so. On the issue of trust and company service providers, I think there's a lot more that this bill should be doing, must be doing, on trust and company service providers. And it's unfortunate that the consultation is still, I understand, ongoing, certainly not concluded, on the Office for Professional Body AML supervision, because that should form part of this bill as well. It has been acknowledged widely that OPBAS is not effective and is not working as perhaps the government intended. But the government doesn't yet know what it's going to do. It doesn't yet know how it's going to fix that, if that's going to require further legislation coming back to this House, whether that involves stripping OPBAS of its AML supervision responsibilities and duties at the moment, and if it does that, then where those responsibilities lie. Our suggestion under New Clause 35, is that we would make Companies House an AML supervisor in its own right. I've asked various questions on this as to why the government doesn't believe that Companies House should be an anti-money laundering supervisor in its own right, but it seems to me, and to us in the SNP benches, that if Companies House is the front door for every company that is registered in the United Kingdom, why it should not be liable to anti-money laundering regulations. If we're asking banks and other institutions to look at this, why not a government agency responsible for the registration of every company on these islands? It would give them more duties, and it would stop the flow of guff companies and terrible information and people who seek to defraud our own constituents. It would stop that flow at the front door, and it seems absolutely bizarre to me why the government wouldn't want to shut the door firmly in the face of the crooks and the people that want to do that. I think there is a lot more that could be done, as is mentioned in some of the Labour amendments around the duty and the powers of Companies House. We think the Companies House should have powers. It shouldn't just be powers, it should be duties. They should have to do these things. I don't see why there is any ambiguity in this legislation. If you're saying Companies House should do it, make them do it. Don't leave it up to interpretation or somebody's decision further down the line. Make them do it. Because we all know if you're not forced to do a thing, you might not do a thing. You know, you might not do the dishes, you might not do the laundry, but if you're forced to and you have to, then you certainly will. So I think there's a lot more that could be done there. And again, it's about shutting the door, it's about tightening these regulations as well. We also, within our amendments, seek to tighten things up around the integrity of the register. And this is around New Clause 36, our Amendment 109. It also reflects Labour's Amendment 103 and some of the other amendments which speak to the importance of identification numbers and the integrity of the register itself. And a lot of the evidence that we got in the Bill Committee, and that I've heard other various events, sometimes by the APPG and sometimes other things that are online, that the register at the moment, as it stands, is full of absolute guff. It has had, the Minister waves the legislation, but he isn't intending to fix all of that guff. That's the difficulty. He's allowing that guff to live on the register forever, because there isn't enough in this bill about the retrospective action that Companies House has to take, that it has to go back through all these hundreds and thousands of companies over many, many years that have been allowed to filter onto the register unheeded. Graham Barrow's Twitter is full of this every single day, of companies being registered, where the information is absolute rubbish. So we have to have a means of, again, putting a duty and an obligation onto Companies House to go back through the register, to clear it out, to say that this stuff on here, there is no point in having it because it is actually, in effect, meaningless, and it's gumming up the rest of the system for those that want to use the register in legitimate ways. And we need to be able to make sure that we keep a check on Companies House. That's why it says that we seek to ensure that registrations contain accurate, up-to-date information, and that they come back to Parliament on the progress and the update of that register. Because again, we can't expect these things to happen overnight. It's a big register, there's an awful lot on there. But we need to make sure that it's accurate. Because if it's not accurate, there are consequences, and there are very real consequences for our constituents. As, again, Graham Barrow had pointed out, with people who have found themselves being defrauded, people whose names or whose addresses or both have been used inaccurately, where they've been chased, where they've been pursued by criminals, where there's been all kinds of things that have happened to people because there's fraudulent information on the Companies House register. And it may not be actually that you'll even find out that your own name has been used fraudulently. You know, if you get a name like James Smith or something like that, you may never find out. There's only 3 Alison Thewlisses on the register. They're all me. There should be one identification for that. I shouldn't be on the register as 3 people, hence why we seek a unique identifier to track people through all of your life. But if your name has been registered and abused without your knowledge, with an address that isn't yours, maybe a mailbox somewhere, you may not find out about that, but you may end up being liable for some of the actions of these fraudsters. So I think there's a lot more that can be done on this. Also, within this, we seek to limit the number of directorships that people should have. Because, yes, people may have multiple directorships, but if you're really the director of 300 companies, are you actually able to do that job properly? Probably not, because it's probably not a real company and you're probably not acting as a proper director. But yet, again, on the Companies House register, there are many such people that are registered for hundreds of companies. And I think, as a red flag within the system, that should be something that stands out to Companies House, and they should be able to say, actually, is this person a real director, and do more investigation on that. Our amendment here would seek to encourage that as well. I'm quite pleased to see Government Amendments 30 and 32 giving Scottish ministers the power to present a petition to wind up Scottish limited partnerships. Scottish limited partnerships have been abused comprehensively for several years now. It has been a real problem, and giving the power to Scottish ministers to do something about that is very important, because at the moment although they are called Scottish Limited Partnerships, they have very little in practice to do with the Scottish Government, and there's very little that can be done about it from there. So that is an important power. And I'm very grateful to Michael Clancy of the Law Society of Scotland, and I hope that he is correct in his belief that it is a practical measure that will be able to be used. And I would ask the Minister if he could maybe outline in his response any further discussions that he's had with Scottish ministers and how he sees this power working in practice. I think I'm prepared to leave my remarks at that, because I appreciate other members want to get in and also have things to discuss. But I would just like to leave the Minister with a quote from evidence from the Public Bill Committee of the 25th of October from Bill Browder, who has been a great champion for corporate transparency and standing up against corruption internationally. And he said to committee, "You can write as many great laws as you want. There's some good stuff in this law and good stuff in the previous laws, but if no one is going to enforce it, then you're never going to change the risk reward and people are going to carry on doing stuff. All this will continue, and I will sit here 10 years from now making the same allegations about how this is a centre of money laundering." Nobody wants to be sitting here in 10 years, well, certainly not us on these benches. But we don't want to see money laundering going on unabated. We want to see the government taking the opportunity that it has in this bill to close the loopholes, to get it right now, to take the advice and the knowledge that members across this House and external organisations have brought to it. Make the amendments, fix this bill, and you will get cross-party support for it.